Right. So you see now Andrew O'Keefe, who is going to talk to us about some of the findings that he has made while studying First Nations, as you have seen in the invitation. He's a former HR executive and a consultant in leadership matters, and has dedicated several years to that study. So I have the book. It's a very nice one. And unfortunately, I haven't read everything. I'm cherry picking at the moment and sometimes stopping on the page to think a bit, because there is a lot of thinking matter in that. So thank you, Andrew, for writing this, taking the time and all the travel and all the study necessary to write this book. And I'm afraid you're not going to be able to say everything in 20 minutes, but possibly a selection of some of the findings that you have made. And we're very happy to have you, and very grateful that you agreed to this meeting at a late hour for you.
It's a pleasure, Antoine, and thank you very much for the invitation and everybody for joining in to share some of the findings that I've synthesized in visiting 11 First Nation societies in different parts of the world. So I live in Australia, and I've spent my life in Australia, and I've been really interested in leadership in workplaces, in working with companies like IBM and Cable and Wireless Optus. Just in terms of any background noise, I think it might be handy. Most people are on mute. I think it'd be good if people just check their mute button and avoids disruption for others. Thank you very much. And in 2016, I was motivated to investigate the leadership, thinking and practices of First Nations when I had conversations with several Maasai elders in Kenya. My wife and I were on holidays, and I thought in planning that visit it'd be really interesting to learn a different perspective of leadership, different to the one that I had studied and that most of us would have been practicing over our careers. And in sitting down with several Maasai elders on that first trip, I was just so inspired with the depth and breadth of thinking. But several months after that, I decided that given that I'd only just touched the surface, that I would make this a study, a course of adventure, and a real investigation to find out whether what I was learning from the Maasai was consistent, whether there were, and what were the common principles across different First Nation societies. And the key concept that I've also reflected on is that the wisdom of First Nations has not been incorporated into leadership practice since the study of leadership in workplaces began only about 100 years ago. So we've got only a handful, several generations of scholarly work looking at workplaces. And given the social setting of the early 1900s, when workplace leadership emerged as a discipline, the scholars and captains of industry back then, given the social setting, ignored the wisdom of First Nations that would have been readily available. And they were thinking that they were starting with a clean sheet. And the clean sheet that was the foundation on which our leadership practices was built was really an authoritarian model of leadership. And we would do things very differently. We would have done things differently, my proposition is, over the last 100 years of workplace leadership, if we'd paid attention to the wisdom that's been developed over the millennia. And I'm going to share in this 20 minutes or so as preliminary conversation three key concepts. And I should also give as background the 11 First Nation societies that I visited. And so I visited and sat down with people going from west to east in Africa. So as well as a second visit to Maasai, I visited Samburu, who are very similar to Maasai. I visited the famous Bushmen in the Kalahari of Namibia, and also the Himba people on the west coast of Namibia, who overwhelmingly continued to live their traditional village life. In Australia, in Central Australia, some will know in Central Australia, the city of Alice Springs, I visited the Aranda people, and also on the border of Northern Territory and Western Australia, a very remote part of the country, Pintabee people. And one of the sensational experiences of visiting Pintabee is meeting one woman who's become a friend, who's roughly about my age, so either side of 60, Marlene is. She was 11 when she first came across a European or a white person. She was 11, living the traditional life. So that was in Australia, two nations in Australia. In New Zealand, obviously, Maori society. In the Amazon, Quechua, and also Warani, where peaceful contact with Warani only began in the late 1950s. So I met people who remembered and grew up living the traditional life. And in North America, in the Pacific north of Canada, Haida society. And on the east coast of Canada, Mohawk society, whose traditional lands were upstate New York. So they're the 11 societies representing a whole range of traditional societies, from hunter-gatherer to people who lived in traditional times in permanent settlements. There are a number of common principles, and the three that I want to share. First is about who gets to be chosen as leader. I'll talk about that. I want to talk about the power of followers in First Nations societies compared to the power that we give followers in workplaces. And third, I want to talk about organisational design, how these societies are consistently designed and what we can learn about designing workplaces to be functional, avoiding dysfunction in design. So the first one, which is a standout, was the key attribute of who gets to be chosen as leader. And this word being respect for people. Respect was shared with me so often in just about every society and almost everybody I spoke to when I asked them questions about your chief and who gets to be chosen as your leader. The overwhelming attribute, the single greatest attribute, was that this person was chosen to be our leader, chosen to be our chief, because they had the attribute of respect for people. They're also obviously very capable. They're also wise and made good decisions, and that they had in their character respect for others. Now, we know that. Everybody on the call would know that's obvious, and that's how it should be, and that's good leadership practice, and they're the leaders that we've enjoyed working for, and I think most of us would, in our leadership roles, would aspire to be of that sort of character of leader. But what's a standout in First Nations is the discipline that's applied in having leaders, continuing to have leaders who have respect for others in their makeup. And so strong is that in societies where hereditary plays a role and might be the single biggest factor in deciding the next leader in terms of succession planning, if that person next in line does not have the attribute of respect for others in their character, they will be passed over. So in Haida society in the Northern Pacific, in Maori society in New Zealand, as two examples, there's another society that I didn't meet, but I investigated in traditional times in the southern part of Australia, where hereditary played a role. The next in line was passed over if they didn't have in their character respect for others. Maasai people continually talked about respect, and then that leads to the behaviours that demonstrate respect. Respect isn't a behaviour in itself. The signpost would be, what are the behaviours which demonstrate respect, or the behaviours that demonstrate disrespect. And so people, to quote a number of the Maasai that I met, yeah, our leader, our chief, they have a calm temperament. They never get angry. Often in societies that are organised as a village or those organised as divisions and nations, generosity. Our chief is generous, and in traditional times, chief was always the most generous and often poor because of that. So generosity is often mentioned. They're a big listener. You can't imagine being respectful of others if we're not an effective listener, but they're a big listener. That they know the individuals in their division or in their section. So they know people well and what makes that person the person that they are as an individual. So these attributes were often being mentioned, and it all points to respect. So in workplaces, as I say, we know that's basic management, but in workplaces, at least in my experience, we don't have that discipline that First Nations people do of either not choosing, or if people emerge in their leadership roles and forget that attribute that served them well as a younger person and that warranted their promotion into leadership or continued promotion through higher level of management. In workplaces, we don't have that same sort of discipline, and we let other factors dominate or convince, or we rationalise, and then we impose disrespectful leaders on people, and guaranteed we won't get the best out of people, and we won't have the most productive and enjoyable places to work. So that was the first factor that came through so strongly, and as I say, would not be compromised, which is respect for people. The second factor I want to talk about is the power of followers. So bear in mind that the investigation of workplace leadership, beginning at 100 years ago, where the late great Peter Drucker dated management as a practice emerging from JP Morgan at the time, who appointed the first professional managers, and the scholars began investigating leadership from about that point. About that time, Harvard University set up its business school. And the proposition is that the view of leadership then was an authoritarian view, and our practices have really been built on that platform. And so we inherit in today's generation key concepts of leadership being authoritarian and directing others. In First Nations, they have a very different view about followership and the power of followers. And two examples. One is that followers really decide the leader who will be their chief. And I'm particularly thinking now about societies like the Maasai, Haida and Mohawk, who are organised at quite a high level. What I mean by that is, and I'll come back to this point with organisational design, there are some societies that are designed around up to the level of village, so maybe 80, 100, 150 people, and villages in that level society are independent. There's no high level of organisation above the village level, so as divisions or nation. There are some societies though, like Maasai and Haida, who are organised at a level above the village where the villages are not independent, and there are divisional chiefs. And then there's others like Mohawk in the eastern side of North America, who are organised up to the national level. So in those societies organised at the division and national level, their chiefs are pretty well decided. Reham, you might put Reham, Reham Ibrahim, thank you very much. Those societies allow the followers to very much decide their chief. So in Maasai, for instance, when a group of young warriors are put together for initiation, they over the next 2 or 3 years will decide their chief. The elders say that our role is only to guide the warriors, guide the followers in their choice of leader. And the similar applies in a different method. The similar applies in Haida in the Pacific of Canada, far northern Pacific, where it's the aunties and the clan mother, as it is in Mohawk society. The clan mother decides the leader. And what emerges from this too is the incredible time that's taken to decide the leader. They don't do the equivalent of advertising the role, doing a couple of interviews, maybe some psychological assessments, and making the appointment. They keep their eye on the young people. They know the candidates well. They spend a lot of time in observation, and it's the followers who have the single biggest say, either directly or through the clan mothers representing the followers in the society, who appoint the chief. And I think we can follow that practice in workplaces. It wouldn't be hard to imagine, and I've worked at least one place that did and another place that did a variation of this, where the followers are asked about their view about the appointment of the person who might lead them as either a team leader or divisional leader. The followers have an incredible amount invested in a good, effective leader being chosen. The power of the followers also comes through if the chief loses their direction or loses their ability or their effectiveness. Then in societies like Haida and Mohawk, it's the clan mother who counsels the chief on behalf of the followers in the community and holds the chief to account, if you like. Whereas in workplaces, the power comes from above. It's the high-level leader who appoints people. It's a patronage system. And then in that system, leaders have to keep managing up, really, and keep on sound relationship with their patron. And the followers don't have the same level of influence. So that's a second element that I think poses a lot of thought and wisdom that we could incorporate into workplace leadership. The third is about organisational design, and organisational design is really critical because we can design our workplaces to be functional, or if we deviate from what I recommend are natural principles, then inadvertently we're designing dysfunction. People will try to do their best work, but we've probably weighed them down with dysfunction in design. The pattern that comes through universally in First Nations is a design around, which is really the building block of human societies, is small family groups aggregated into bands or villages of a certain and predictable size. The size of family groups numbers about 7 or thereabouts people, aggregating into villages of up to around about 150. Many of you will know the 150 correlates with the investigations and studies, the scholarly work of Dunbar from Oxford University, which links to the size of the human brain, or size relative to body size. So in traditional societies, in First Nations societies, families of a certain size, and I recommend that correlates to team size in workplaces. If we wanted people to be functional in a highly integrated, bonded team, accountable to each other, we'll have people work in teams of 5, 6, 7, 8 people. And that makes the job of the immediate manager doable. They can service that number of people, and then we will aggregate at a departmental level teams into departmental level sized groups of about 50, 80, up to 150. And that up to about 150 is universal across societies that I investigated and other societies that I've read about. So there's a universal. The only variation is the size of the village, and that's driven by the environment in which the people are living and what the land can carry. So in the Kalahari in Africa, in southern Africa, band size was roughly up to about 25, 30 individuals. In Central Australia, even smaller. In the southern part of Australia, much more abundant. Traditional groups lived in up to about 120 people. At the other extreme is in the very abundant environment of North America. Haida people and Mohawk people lived in traditional villages, towns really, of several thousand people. But it wasn't several thousand people in a random sort of organisational way. It was built up by longhouses, the equivalent of a village, and in longhouses, so people lived in their family group, aggregated in a longhouse, where about 60 people resided. So people, again, we see that a family aggregating into, let's call it a village or a longhouse, and then it just meant in very large organisations, as it means in very large workplaces, we just have many, many villages. And if we want to design workplaces to get the best out of people and to allow people to bond and have a sense of loyalty to each other and commitment, we would design our workplaces around people being in teams, aggregated into departments of up to around maximum 150 people, and just keep building on multiple villages to make very large organisations if necessary. So they're the three concepts in my book, First Leaders. There's 11 principles that I've distilled, and they're three that I wanted to share and I think might prompt some useful discussion in the focus or syndicate groups. Thank you, Antoine.
My mic was off. Thank you very much, Andrew, for this very brief presentation. I see that a few people have joined after we started, so obviously they have missed some parts of what we've said to start, and the very first part of your presentation. So what I'll do before we split in groups, what we do usually, I'll restate that, and also I did a bit quickly at the start, so I'll give you a few more explanations. Initiatives of Change Business and Economy program is doing this series on really on sustainability and on the implications of sustainability for businesses and for ourselves as well in our personal lives. And that's a more and more important subject, really. So after we started studying it already 3 years ago, we are still in it. I thought today's presentation was very much in line with the general idea that we are pursuing, which is to find ways to live together as well as to continue our economic system in a more human way that will help satisfy the needs of everyone and at the same time be sustainable. And what we do usually in our meetings is to listen to our guest speaker, like we did today, and then split in smaller groups. And those groups of 6 to 8 people, we do not allocate people really by one, but we leave it to the system to decide. And in those groups, what you'll be asked to do is to get one of those themes as your main theme and discuss your own feelings and experience about it, which at the end can produce either questions or statements that you would like to share with the whole group. So then when we reconvene as a whole group, one or more representatives of each group can then state what's come out of the discussion. So the theme that we've heard today from Andrew is the first was who gets chosen as a leader in the First Nations, and the key characteristic was, as you've heard, respect for others, and as consequences, people who do not get angry, generous people, big listeners. That was the first kind of theme. The second theme was the huge power of followers in those societies. Followers do not just obey, they also decide who will be their chief. They spent in the whole society a lot of time trying to select the future leaders, and followers can cancel the chief with certain procedures if the chief loses his way. That was the second big time, and the third you probably all heard, organizational design with the groups, the size of the groups and the organization. And I think everyone was there by then. So in each of the groups, you can choose your topic, and in between, while I'm creating the groups, if there are any questions for clarifications, you can ask a question to Andrew now. I've seen a question in the chat, but I think it was largely answered because it was about how people choose their chiefs. So I think you largely answered that. No.
Hi, Andrew. This is Jamie Powers calling from Virginia in the United States. First of all, thanks for the great presentation. Looking forward to the book, although I haven't read it yet. And a question I have is whether you saw any evidence that just as the followers were kind of choosing their leaders, did they also have sort of an intentional impact on the size of their village, and how large they thought that was to be appropriate, and in order to stay organized and use resources well, that sort of thing?
No, there was no evidence of that, or like a conscious decision or a council decision that would have gone into that. It was really driven by the natural environment, the abundance, the level of abundance, or the arid nature of the land, which just seemed to drive the number of people that the land could sustain, and therefore how concentrated the population could be. Yeah, so it wasn't. Yeah, it's a good question, James, and it was almost a given based on the natural conditions of the land.
Questions
Thanks,
coming
Andrew.
in the chat box. Is leadership sometimes linked to matriarchy?
A few of the nations that I visited were matriarchal, which meant that the people's association and their clan group was driven by on the female line. Didn't necessarily follow, but it was also tended to be those societies was where the women played a greater role as clan mothers. So in Haida society, Northern Canada, in Mohawk society, it also connected, that was the women who played a key role, almost like the chair of the board or the board of directors, in having a greater influence in representing the community in leadership appointments or the counselling of a leader. As one Haida person told me, who was about to be promoted to the role of chief, he told me, I can never forget the aunties. I should never forget the aunties as being the voice of the people.
There are two hands raised. I don't want to delay too much the starting of the groups, but we can have maybe both questions, Michael and Spencer, and then an answer from Andrew, and then we will move into groups.
Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for a really encouraging presentation. you talked in the first section about respect for people, respect for others, and you talked about generosity. And I'm wondering what you mean by that. Are you talking about generosity of spirit or material generosity or both?
Yeah, both. In material, it comes up when people say that in village life, and I'm thinking particularly about Himba people, and it may have been because it was a drought year, the year that I was there in 2017. It was given as examples that the chief, the head of our village, always makes sure we have enough food. And it came up in Mohawk conversations that in the old days, the chief was perhaps the poorest, that they always made sure other people had enough. And then it also comes up, in spirit, where there's a generous outlook and there's almost like erring on the side of giving individuals the benefit of the doubt. It came up with they're like a servant to us and a servant to the people, and it's always as though we're always on their mind. Yeah, so thanks, Michael. Spencer?